Hello and welcome to today's session of Inspire Interactives. Inspire is a digital magazine launched by All India Professionals Congress, the AIPC, and is available on its official website. AIPC is a department of the Indian National Congress that brings together professionals from all walks of life and stands committed to the tenets of diversity, inclusivity, and equality. The Inspire magazine includes interviews, articles, and features carefully compiled from varied sources, focusing on areas of common concern. Inspire Interactives is the audiovisual arm of our digital outreach. Here we will be talking to change makers, thought influencers, policymakers, AIPC fellows, and indeed non-fellows. In short, anyone and everyone who has a particular perspective to share on a public platform and nurtures a desire to be heard, Inspire Interactives is here for you. It is also our constant endeavor to showcase the work being done in different parts of the country by our fellows. Each AIPC fellow, a professional in their own right. Inspire provides all of us with a dynamic shared space to discuss issues that matter to us, and more importantly, to society at large and the nation in particular. I'm Dr. Vandana R. Singh, Editor-in-Chief of Inspire. We have here with us today Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha. A very warm welcome to you, sir, on this brand new space created for meaningful interactions. Though Mr. Jairam Ramesh needs no introduction, I cannot proceed without saying a few words about his varied interests and the vast database of knowledge that he so calmly possesses. Mr. Jairam Ramesh has been Cabinet Minister and Minister of State for Power, Commerce and Industry, Environment and Forests, Rural Development, and Drinking Water and Sanitation. A mechanical engineer by training, an economist at work, an environmentalist by nature, he is a researcher and a historian by choice. In addition to this, Mr. Ramesh has been at the cutting edge of policy making and development planning at the national level. A multifaceted personality, Mr. Jairam Ramesh is also a prolific writer, and of late has been coming out with a book practically every year for the last 8 years now. Before we talk about your writing, sir, we are keen to know of your personal professional journey, as our viewership is made up largely of professionals from all walks of life. This part of your life is of special interest to us. From IIT to Parliament House, how did this happen? I understand that you have admired Nehru from your early years and that the Buddha has always fascinated you. You have worked closely with prime ministers and you have been warning us about the trajectory of climate change for some years now. Our viewers will find it interesting to know about the transition of an engineer to an environmentalist and now a writer of widely read books. Over to you, sir.
Well, this was not my understanding with you, Vandana. My understanding was that we're going to discuss my book and not discuss me on my professional journey. So, but since you have asked it, I'm not an engineer. I studied engineering. That does not make me an engineer. Never practiced engineer, never been a practicing engineer. But, you know, at the age of 16, in those days, in the 70s, you had no choice. You did what your parents expected you to do. And I was lucky enough to get into IIT at my first shot. So did 5 years. That time the IIT was a 5-year program. And then did what most people of my cohort, my generation, my social background did, which go abroad and studied, at various universities, studied economics, studied management, various issues, various topics and subjects. And I had an opportunity of coming back to India in 1980, at a time when coming back to India was not, the flavor of the day or the flavor of the month or even the flavor of the year. But I had an opportunity of coming back, and I came back to India in the early months of 1980, very early months of 1980. And I started working with different departments in the government of India. And in 1983, sort of established myself working in the field of energy policy. And from there, I went to the Ministry of Industry, worked in the Planning Commission. Then I worked in the Finance Ministry, worked in the Prime Minister's office. And finally, in 1998, actually, I became an office bearer of the Congress Party when the Congress was out of power. And In 2004, I became a member of parliament. In 2006, I became a minister. In 2014, I became an author. So that's really, my trajectory. It's a series of uh, coincidences, series of fortunate circumstances. Mr. Petroda, whom I believe you have interviewed as part of these series, I met Mr. Petroda in 1987 and worked very closely with him for 2.5 years. And it was through Mr. Petroda that I came to have an association with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. And it was through Mr. Petroda that I got associated with the Congress Party in the early months of 1991 for the 91 election campaign. So Mr. Petroda was a key factor in my professional development in '87. Before that, there used to be a civil servant called Mr. Abid Hussain, a very senior civil servant, very well-known civil servant. And he was the one who really lured me into the Planning Commission in '86 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the deputy chairman, and I was interviewed for the position by Dr. Manmohan Singh when he was deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. So Mr. Abid Hussain was another mentor. And before that, there was Mr. Lavraj Kumar, who again was a very senior. He was a technocrat. He was not an IAS officer like Mr. Abid Hussain, and he had been inducted by Indira Gandhi to build up India's petroleum and petrochemical capabilities. And he was the one who really lured me back from India, and I started working with him in the early '80s. So I've had these three mentors, so to speak. Mr. Lavraj Kumar first, Mr. Abid Hussain, and then, of course, Mr. Petroda, who was a very important factor. Subsequently, of course, sort of, worked my way around, and opportunities arose. And so it's good. I mean, it's been a checkered career. It's been in government as a government servant, not part of the civil service formally. I mean, I was a civil servant, but not like the IAS or any organized service, lateral entrant, like Monte Carlovalia and various other people. What I would call the Indian lateral service. There was an ILS, the Indian lateral service.
Yes, you are right. We did have Mr. Petroda with us a couple of days ago, and interestingly, when we asked him about his journey, he mentioned your name, and he said that you were one of the core people who worked with him and helped him in his various initiatives. Your new book, titled "The Light of Asia: The Poem That Defined the Buddha," belongs to an extremely interesting genre. It is a biography of an epic biopoem on the Buddha. Just to set the context about the original epic poem about which you have written, The Light of Asia was composed by Sir Edwin Arnold in the year 1879 and soon took the world by storm. This long poem retold the story of Gautam Buddha to the world at the turn of the last century. The poem influenced many, including Leo Tolstoy, Swami Vivekanand, Jawaharlal Nehru, and C.V. Raman, to name a few. Interestingly, your biography of the poem has been hailed as a significant addition to the study of the revival of Buddhism in the 20th century. Already, It is well regarded as a seminal work that shall grace bookshelves devoted to Buddhist studies. I'm curious to know how this book came to be. Was it in the making for a while, or was there a trigger that initiated this thought process?
Well, it's certainly not COVID that triggered the book. So I had no message of solace and sustenance and, rediscovery of the Buddha during a period of crisis. No, it's been in my on my mind for many years, and since 2014, since I've had the time, I've written a number of books, but they've largely been on the environment. A couple of books have been on the economy, and I wrote three biographies, political biographies, the environmental biography of Indira Gandhi, the biography of P.N. Huxer, the most powerful and influential civil servant India has had in the last 70 years, and then, of course, most recently, a biography of the extremely charismatic, colorful, and controversial V.K. Krishna Menon, who had to resign as defense minister in November of 1962 in the aftermath of the war with China. So, this was, what I was doing. What I liked doing was really archival research. I don't write books based on oral history. I don't write books based on recollections or interviews or secondary material. And that's why each one of the books that I've written is being based basically almost wholly on archival work, both in India and abroad. And I wanted to do a different type of a book last year after my Krishna Menon biography had come out. I said it's enough. Three biography of his individuals is enough. So what type of biography can one do? And that's when this old idea that I had of doing a biography of this poem. The Buddha has always fascinated me. As I'm sure he fascinates most Indians. We are not Buddhist in the religious sense of the term, but Buddha is very much part of our lives. He's very much part of the Indian DNA. He's been absorbed into the Indian consciousness, Indic consciousness, and he's not a mythological figure. He's a historical figure. So Buddha has always captivated and enamored me. The life of the Buddha and what made Buddha the phenomenon that he became, not just in the subcontinent, but all over Asia and subsequently in other parts of the world. When I sat down to think about what to write, this poem, which I had read when I was maybe 14 years old or 15 years old, it just remained in my mind, the light of Asia. And so I said, why not rediscover the reason why this book became such a great phenomenon and sensation when it was first published in 1879, and why it continues to resonate across the world. And in the process of writing the biography of the poem, I ended up doing the biography of the poet. So this is a two-in-one biography. It's a biography of the poem, The Light of Asia, an epic poem, 50,000 lines on the life of the Buddha. And it's also the biography of the poet, Sir Edwin Arnold. And this is where, I have a point of disagreement with the chairman of the AIPC, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, my good friend Shashi Tharoor, my colleague Shashi Tharoor. He would dismiss Sir Edwin Arnold as an apologist for the British Empire, which he was, by the way. But where I disagree with Shashi, of course, is that there was a generation of Britishers in the 19th century, James Princip, Alexander Cunningham, Max Muller, Monio Williams, and certainly Edwin Arnold, who did not set out to popularize Indian culture or Indian civilization in order to justify Queen Victoria's rule in India. I mean, they were apologists for the British Raj, no doubt, but they were also genuinely enraptured and captivated by India's cultural legacy, the rich cultural traditions of India, the diverse cultural traditions of India. the Hindu tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Buddhist traditions, the Jain traditions, the Christian traditions. So Edwin Arnold belonged to that, much abused word Orientalist. Edward Syed made Orientalist a term of abuse, but in the strict, purest academic sense of the term, Edwin Arnold was one of the eminent Orientalists of the 19th century who translated the Gita Govinda, translated the Mahabharata, translated the Hitopadesha. And most importantly, Vandana, which many of us don't realize, he translated the Bhagavad Gita into English in 1885. And it is that English translation of the Bhagavad Gita that became the defining text for Mahatma Gandhi for the rest of his life. Gandhi writes in his autobiography that he came to the Gita through Edwin Arnold's translation. And it is this translation that formed an anchor as far as Mahatma Gandhi was concerned till his very last hours. So Edwin Arnold is eminently interesting, not just because of the light of Asia, but because of who he was and the generation of which he was part of, the era in which he grew, and the influence that he had on a diverse set of people abroad, and most importantly in the subcontinent as well. So this was roughly the trigger for writing this book. The trigger really was to understand why this book became a milestone in the historiography of the rediscovery of Buddha in the 19th century. Buddha, the process of discovery of the Buddhas really begins. It's an epigraphic discovery, rediscovery. It's a numismatic rediscovery. It's an archaeological rediscovery. It's a textual rediscovery. And by the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Buddha comes to be firmly established in the consciousness of the world as a man who really showed a completely different path when during the time that he lived, which continued to have relevance for so many centuries. So in a way, I suppose you could say that I wrote this book because of my fascination for the Buddha. It was not so much a fascination for the poet, but it's a fascination for the life of the Buddha, which was captured by Edwin Arnold so beautifully in his poem.
So, as you said, that it is both your book. It is a biography of the poem, and it's also a biography of, in a manner of speaking, of Sir Edwin Arnold. And in one of your interviews elsewhere, I've heard you talk about his family that you traced that is still in India. Would you tell us a little bit about
I discovered his great grandchildren in Bhopal, with wonderfully syncretic names like Mickey Mohammed Arnold, Fauzia Sultana Arnold. Because Edwin Arnold's son, Channing Arnold, became a tutor to the princely family, the Nawabs of Bhopal, and he married a local Muslim lady. He died in Sultanpur, murdered in Sultanpur in UP over a property dispute. He had two children, one son who was raised, in a Muslim family in Bhopal, and a daughter, Sajida, who was raised by Christian missionaries and became Grace, and went away to England after a while in India. And I discovered, through archival work, see, archives, one thing leads to another in the archives. I was looking for archives, mention of Channing and Arnold, and suddenly I discovered a 1937 police report of the then CP, Central Provinces, which talked about the murder of this Englishman, the son of the author of The Light of Asia, in 1937. And this was a poem that had been published in 1879. So through that, and in that news item, in that police report, it said that he was drawing a pension. He was drawing a pension from Bhopal. So it could only mean that he was drawing a pension from the princely family. So I did some research in the Bhopal archives, spoke to a few people, with the Bhopal royal family, and discovered the history of Channing Arnold, whose grandson, Mickey Arnold, I got in touch with in Bhopal. So it's sort of a interesting coda to this entire book that, I discover his great grandchildren living in Bhopal.
So, just stepping back a bit and going back to what you said about Arnold being viewed as an what later Edward Said has given us a phrase for as an Orientalist. Um, but in his own time, he was also viewed as an imperialist.
Yes.
Which he was. Given that he was this interesting mix of things, would you say that in today's context, somebody like Edwin Arnold would be viewed as somebody who's inclusive rather than
Well,
somebody
uh,
who belongs
I
nowhere?
think as I said, this is where Shashi and I part company. I don't think that Edwin Arnold sat down and said, I'm going to write an epic poem on the life of the Buddha, which will justify British rule in India. I don't think he translated the Bhagavad Gita with a view to justifying a British rule in India. So there were two sides to these people. There were two sides to Alexander Cunningham. There were two sides to William Jones. There were two sides to Warren Hastings. By the way, I won't put Robert Clive into this category. This is in this category I would put Warren Hastings, Charles Wilkins, William Jones, James Prinsep, Alexander Cunningham, Max Muller, and of course Edwin Arnold. So I think they were Orientalists in the scholarly sense of the term. They were fluent in Sanskrit. And in the case of Edwin Arnold, he knew Marathi also very well because he was principal of the Pune College from 1857 to 1860, which subsequently became the Deccan College. Of course, he was proficient in many other languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, Latin, French, German, so on. But you see, so I don't think he learned Sanskrit in order to find sources for Queen Victoria's rule in India. So yeah, they believed, Edwin Arnold believed in the modernizing mission of British rule in India. He believed that the railways and the telegraph and the law and order, the bringing together of different states was a great British contribution. He knew that Britain at some stage had to exit India, but he did not. He was an early nation builder, if you want to use today's terminology. He believed in nation building, but he immersed himself he lived in India. He immersed himself in India's diverse civilizational legacy, literary, cultural, art, architecture, and so on. Uh, so there were two personalities as far as Edwin Arnold was concerned, and people of that generation, particularly in England. They were colonialists, to use today's term. They believed in the British Empire. They were great admirers of Dalhousie and later on Curzon. But at the same time, they were people who were absolutely enamored of India's literary, artistic, cultural, religious, philosophical legacy. So I don't dismiss them. In fact, I think that they did a lot in the reawakening of interest in India, on India's legacy itself. I mean, Buddha had been forgotten, Ashoka had been forgotten, and the rediscovery of Buddha, the rediscovery of Ashoka, the rediscovery of India's Buddhist heritage. Remember, between roughly the 3rd century BC and the 5th century AD, or Common Era, for a period of about maybe 600 or 700 years, Buddhism was the dominant faith in what we call the subcontinent today. So there's a enormous heritage, which it had just got obliterated for a number of circumstances, because for a number of reasons. But that was revived in the late 19th century and the early 20th century because of this remarkable generation of Orientalists, many of whom were Britishers, some were French, many were German, and of course, there were a large number of Indians who helped this Oriental generation. I mean, Rajendra Lala Mitra, for example, is a very important name in the rediscovery of India's cultural heritage, particularly as it relates to Buddha in the late 19th century. And I mean, to give you an example, the Kama Sutra is often attributed, the English translation of the Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra is often attributed to Sir Richard Burton. But actually, the translation was done by Bhagwan Lal Indraji, an Indian scholar, which was, who was commissioned to do the translation by Richard Burton. And of course, history remembers Richard Burton. It doesn't remember Bhagwan Lal, Indraji. So I think there was this generation of scholars in India who were interlocutors for the French, for the Germans, for the Danes. There were Danish scholars, there were Norwegian scholars, Scandinavian scholars, European scholars, and British scholars. So I don't dismiss this. I don't dismiss this as a colonial project. I mean, it's very easy to say whatever happened in the 19th century is a colonial enterprise. It's an empire building enterprise. I know this is the common refrain nowadays. But I have a slightly different take on this, because I think that these people were genuine scholars. They explored India's legacy at depth and rediscovered for Indians what Indians themselves had forgotten.
While we're on the topic of your writing, I'd also like you to elaborate on your other book titled Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature. Mrs. Indira Gandhi's time as Prime Minister is known for and remembered for many different reasons. But few think of her as an environmentalist or are even aware of her singular love for nature. For instance, her contribution to saving the tiger or preservation of wildlife is perhaps not so well known. It'll be interesting to know from you about this aspect of her personality and how she's the pioneer of wildlife preservation and environment protection, not just in the local context, but on the global stage as well.
Well, I think she was India's first and last Prime Minister to walk the talk as far as environment is concerned. Walk the talk, that's important. Not just talk, but walk the talk on environment. So today, for example, if you look at all the laws we have, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, the Water Pollution Control Act of 1974, the Forest Conservation Act of 1980, the Air Pollution Control Act of 1981. These are the four foundational laws for protecting the environment. Subsequently, of course, we had the Environment Protection Act of 1986, but that followed the Bhopal gas tragedy. But during Indira Gandhi's time, we had these four basic pillars, the legislative pillars. Then we had the institutions, the Central Pollution Control Board and the various state pollution control boards. Then we had the various rules and regulations, for example, rules governing coastal areas, coastal zones. And then, of course, we had the administrative apparatus. I mean, the Ministry of Environment, for example, got created in November of 1980 with Indira Gandhi herself as the first cabinet minister for environment. And she held that position till her assassination 4 years later. See, when we talk of Indira Gandhi, we have one of two images. We have the Durga image of Indira Gandhi, bold, courageous, tough, who stood up to Nixon, told the Americans where they got off, helped liberate Bangladesh, split Pakistan, taught the Pakistanis a lesson, tough leader, broke no nonsense from anybody. The Durga image. And then the other image, of course, is the architect of the emergency, and civil liberties were curbed. And that was a period, where she made a colossal error of judgment. So you have one of these you have her army of admirers, and you have her legion of critics. But I argue in my biography that Indira Gandhi saw herself not as a political leader. She was born into a political family, but she didn't see herself as a political leader. Her self awareness was that of an environmentalist. She saw herself as a child of nature. She saw herself as a child of the mountains, as a child of forests, as a child of rivers, as somebody who bonded with wildlife. That's because of the nature, manner in which she grew up. She spent a year in Shantiniketan, which was crucial to her development of her personality. She studied in Switzerland because of the illness of her mother. And so, Switzerland also was an important factor in shaping her approach to nature. And Salim Ali, India's greatest ornithologist, she became aware of Salim Ali's work thanks to her father in 1941 when she herself was in jail in Naini Central Prison for a year. And that's when she becomes a bird watcher. And she's one of the founder members of the Delhi Bird Watching Society in early 1950. So she was a remarkable person because I think that's what really animated her. It was not so much politics. I mean, she was, I think she was a politician by compulsion, but an environmentalist by conviction. And even today, in fact, in June of 1970, June of 2022, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of her historic speech at Stockholm, which people still regard as a milestone in international environmental discourse. Her famous speech at the UN conference on Stockholm, on the environment in Stockholm. When the Paris conference on climate change took place, there were 90 prime ministers and presidents who were attending, including, of course, our prime minister, everybody. President Obama was there, everybody. There were 90 presidents and prime ministers in 2015 at Paris. But in 1972, at the first UN conference on the human environment, uh, Indira Gandhi was the only prime minister who was present, other than the host prime minister, Olaf Palme. And that's in that speech. She spoke about deforestation. She spoke about changing weather patterns, changing climatic factors. And she talked about all the issues that we regard today as central to the concept of sustainable development. Her fight against big dams, her Silent Valley, the whole Silent Valley movement for protection of the rainforest in the Western Ghats, her firm stand on the Tehri Dam, in Uttarakhand, and her stand against big dams in Gujarat, in Madhya Pradesh, in different parts of the country. And of course, the programs that she initiated for the lion, for the tiger, for crocodiles, for various animal species, for biodiversity. So I often say that, if our forests are left is because of the Forest Conservation Act. And we've had the Forest Conservation Act largely because of the personal commitment and personal involvement of the Prime Minister. I mean, she was not, see, on matters relating to foreign policy, on matters relating to defense, on matters relating to economics, she was advised. I've written a biography of P.N. Huxer, and P.N. Huxer was her great mentor, was her alter ego, was her intellectual advisor on foreign policy and on strategic matters. But there was one area in which she needed no advice. She was herself the advisor to others, and that's environment. People like Salim Ali were her friends. They were part of her circle. But she needed no advice from any bureaucracy. She would often lead the bureaucracy. And in fact, in the Wildlife Protection Act was drafted. She was taking meetings on the Wildlife Protection Act the same evening, the mornings of which she would be discussing what to do about Bangladesh. We are talking now of the months of September and October of 1971. That's when meetings are held on Bangladesh, and at the same time, meetings are being held on the Wildlife Protection Act. So it shows bill, I mean, not the act. The bill became an act in 1972. So it shows her personal involvement, her personal commitment. She was not. This was not something that the bureaucracy was pushing her. She was pushing the bureaucracy. She was ahead of the bureaucracy as far as the environment is concerned. So I see her. That's why the title of the biography of Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature. It's not a life in politics.
Yeah.
It's a life in nature. She was a naturalist. She was a natural naturalist. She was not a natural politician.
It really is very fascinating when one thinks of her as a product of her times.
Yeah.
And those were the days when we didn't think of cutting trees as deforestation.
Till
When,
1972, we were shooting tigers.
yes, when tigers were shot as
The
pastime.
moratorium, the
Yes,
moratorium on the shooting of tigers was imposed only in 1970. The
yes,
moratorium, but tigers were still being shot.
they
It's
were still.
only in 1972 that shooting is banned. So
And for no productive purpose, just being shot just for as a pastime for.
shikar, tourist licenses, royalty, all the great royal names who became, in fact, it's one of the great paradoxes of India that all the great conservationists have been the Maharajas, who have been the biggest tiger killers in their youth.
Yes.
The princely families. They were all wildlife big game hunters, but who became subsequently great conservationists. Many of them under the influence of Indira Gandhi herself.
And crocodiles were routinely shot to be turned into
Yeah,
suitcases.
absolutely. Crocodiles and no, it's not just tigers, by the way, Vandana. It's lions. Her first project was on the Gir lion, was Project Lion in the Gir Sanctuary. Then she started Project Tiger in 1973, Project Crocodile to protect the crocodile, the magarmach, and the gharial. Then she had Siberian cranes. Then, of course, she had this big project in South India to protect the lion-tailed macaw, monkey, lion-tailed macaque monkey. And then she waged this long battle to protect the bird wealth of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and other ecologically fragile zones of the country. So she was, as I said, I mean, to her, uh, 16 years that she was prime minister, all the biographies focus on her political achievements or her political failures. But I wanted to get away from that and reveal a little known aspect of a much written about but little understood personality.
It could also be her very lonely childhood with her father away in prison
Yeah, I mean,
and her
the
mother
fact
not
that,
well.
lonely childhood, her mother had to live, stay only in hilly areas, Nainital, Mussoorie, Almora, Srinagar, because she was suffering from tuberculosis. Her own illness, which forced her to be hospitalized in Switzerland. Her education in Shantiniketan. Her mother's brother was Dr. Kaul, K.N. Kaul, a herpetologist and a botanist, one of the India's early botanists. Nehru himself, of course, was a great nature lover, because when you spend 10 years in jail, you tend to become observant of things around you. And Nehru has written in many of his books that, he became an expert on insects, he became an expert on birds, because of the long time he spent in jail. Salim Ali, of course, is a major influence both on Nehru as on Indira Gandhi. And it's thanks to Salim Ali, for example, that the Bharatpur sanctuary gets protected. Silent Valley is another great achievement of Salim Ali.
Mr. Ramesh, no conversation with you can be complete without talking of climate change. The most recent report of the IPCC on the subject has confirmed our worst fears. We are witnessing a man-made disaster and are hurtling headlong into a very dark future. Given your views on environment protection and your active contribution in the area when you were minister and later, one can assume that the report came as no surprise to you. And in a lighter vein, if I may ask, when the report became public, did you have some quiet I told you so moments? Is it frustrating being a sincere environmentalist with a worldview at a time when the country seems preoccupied with petty issues rather than looking at the larger picture?
Well, I've always had I told you so moments because 10 years ago, when I started this whole, when I became environment minister, I went to call on Dr. Manmohan Singh and I asked him, this was on the 31st of May, 2009. And I asked him, sir, why me? I mean, I have nothing to do with the environment. I'm not an environmentalist. All my experience has been in economics or in energy. So he said, well, I want you to join the environment ministry because international environmental diplomacy is becoming very important. And I want India to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. That's all he told me, nothing else. And since then, for 26 months that I was the minister, every day I struggled. I tried, I had to wage a lonely battle in the media, lonely battle against the bureaucracy, lonely battle against the political establishment, the political class, in order to instill and drive home the point that India may not have caused global warming, but India is the biggest victim of global warming. The impact it has on our monsoon, the impact it has on our sea levels, the impact it has on our forests, the impact it has on our glaciers. There's no country in the world which is as vulnerable to climate change as India is. So, I started having debates in parliament. I started engaging with the media. I started engaging with the NGOs. And I was criticized bitterly by my friend, by my good friend, the late Mr. Arun Jaitley, and many others in the BJP for mortgaging India's sovereignty, for saying that, for saying basically that we should be going on a low carbon growth trajectory. And they're saying that we are sacrificing India's growth prospects. And many people in the bureaucracy, many people in industry, many people in the media, the Times of India particularly, and certainly, people like Dr. Murli Manohar Joshi, Sushma Swaraj, Arun Jaitley, all of them, just jumped on me. But I had the full support and backing of Dr. Manmohan Singh. And at Copenhagen in 2009 and at Cancun in 2010, I was able to bring about a change in India's approach. And India began to be seen to be part of the solution, not problem. We were seen to be argumentative. We were seen to be running away from our responsibility. We were seen to be telling the Americans all the time, you cause the problem, you fix it. We have a right to pollute, because we have a large population and our per capita emissions is very low. So I am very, very glad that yesterday's critics have become today's greatest evangelists and have become the greatest champions. I remember an anecdote in this regard in 2013 when Dr. Manmohan Singh went and had his meeting with President Obama. There was a paragraph on climate change, which was inserted in the joint statement. And that was criticized in Parliament. And people pointed their finger at me because even though I was not environment minister then, I was rural development minister. And I remember people saying, oh, ये तो जयराम का काम है, ये तो पूर्व मंत्री का काम है, इन्होंने वो statement लगा दिया है. And I was criticized. And in fact, I think even Mr. Modi, who was then CM of Gujarat, was critical of that statement. But, Vandana, in September 2014, a joint statement was issued between Mr. Narendra Modi and Mr. Obama. And that exact paragraph, full stop, comma, semicolon, that exact paragraph is reproduced in the joint statement of 2014. Exact paragraph. The paragraph which was attacked by Mr. Modi and Mr. Modi's party in 2013, September 2013. In September 2014, they accept it as part of their, as part of their approach. Good. So I feel vindicated. Today, people are more concerned about climate change because the frequency of extreme events. I mean, look at the rainfall today in Delhi. Can you imagine? We are in the middle of September, and it looks as if we are in the last week of July or the first week of August. So frequency of natural disasters is increased. We're having more frequent floods. We're having more frequent landslides. We have more frequent heat waves. So people are far more concerned. People are far more aware. And I haven't said so publicly, but privately, I always say, wow, just imagine 10 years ago, I had to fight these same guys who today are getting up and becoming the great champions of climate change. And, I was being criticized for bartering away India's development, for, bartering away India's sovereignty. But today the environment has changed. Today, I think we are far more proactive. And the commitments, Vandana, we took on in Paris in 2015, December, were the same commitments we had made in Copenhagen in 2009, for which I was attacked. Was the same commitments I announced in Cancun in 2010, for which I was attacked. But we took on those commitments in 2015. It's okay. We move on.
But is it frustrating being a sincere environmentalist with a worldview at a time when the country seems preoccupied with several petty issues rather than looking at the larger picture?
No, what worries me is that the present government has the right rhetoric on environment, but its actions are not commensurate, do not reflect that rhetoric. They want to be seen as great environmental stewards, globally. They want to be seen as responsible environmental citizens. But look at their track record domestically. They're weakening the Environmental Protection Act. They're weakening and diluting the coastal zone regulations. They're weakening and diluting all pollution norms. They are weakening and diluting the forest laws, all in the name of ease of doing business. And the environment minister gets up in parliament and says, we have cleared 3,000 projects. So I had to stand up and say, Mr. Javadekar, the job of the Minister of Environment is not to clear projects. The job of the Minister of Environment is to implement environmental laws without fear or favor. Your job is not to clear projects. So you see, this whole, I think Niti Aayog has been a great contributor to this mindset, to look at environment as a regulatory burden, to look at, let's loosen environmental laws in order to push industrial growth, in order to push investment. I think this is a very short-sighted and suicidal step that we are embarking on. We have already loosened all the labor laws, and now the next target is to loosen all the environmental laws.
Yeah, I suppose the environmental ministry cannot be like the RTO office, which is just giving licenses.
I mean, Mr. Bhupender Yadav, the new minister, is a very well-meaning person. In fact, by the way, he read Indira Gandhi's, he read my biography of Indira Gandhi, and we have discussed at length. And he says she may be our political opponent, but I respect her contributions in the field of environment. But the question is, will Mr. Bhupender Yadav be allowed to function? Because there is a larger agenda. The larger agenda is $5 trillion economy. The larger agenda is that of the Niti Aayog, no, to look at all these environmental issues as bakwas. This is, okay, we keep saying sustainability, sustainable development, green energy. We use the right words, but are we walking the talk? That's the issue.
Going back to your book and putting it in the context of the current scenario of active divisiveness, would you say it is ironical and even pathetic that this environment of suspicion and distrust has taken root in the land that gave birth to Gautam Buddha and Mahatma Gandhi? In the light of this, what would be your message to the youth of today? And not just youth, those who are older, those who have left their professional lives behind them. Is it not time for each and every one of us to contribute in some way towards detoxifying the world?
Undoubtedly, I think the atmosphere is, the political atmosphere is toxic. And of course, the natural environment is also toxic. Whether it's air pollution, whether it's water pollution, whether it's chemical contamination, deforestation. No, I mean, going back to The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha, on which we started our conversation. I think in fact, I think the reason why that epic poem became a sensation, why it got translated into 30 languages, including 12 languages in India, and why it became an iconic text for so many Indians from different walks of life, was because the poem focused on the humanity of Buddha, not on the divinity of Buddha. And I believe that India is a divinity surplus, humanity deficit country. We have to rediscover not the roots of divinity, we have to rediscover the roots of humanity. We are losing humanity in our obsession with divinity. And I think that's the essential message that one carries from the life of the Buddha. And that's the essential message that I wanted to convey by writing this biography. That Buddha is not about divinity. Buddha is about humanity. Buddha is about social change. And I think those are the issues that really should concern us.
We hear a lot of
We are, as I said, we गड्ढा खोदो तो divinity निकलता है. We are really a divinity surplus country.
So we hear a lot of youth and a lot of urban population taking to, well, some kind of Buddhism and being into and so on and so forth.
But for me, Buddhism is not contemplation. Buddhism is not meditation.
Yes.
Buddhism is not navel gazing. I think that's the wrong tradition that we have given. I think I'm more a believer in the Ambedkar and Kosambi interpretation of Buddhism. I'm not a great believer in the Buddhism that Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, and all Indians believe that, Buddha, compassion, understanding, tolerance, meditation, contemplation, spirituality, that's there. But there is more to it. And that's what Ambedkar and Kosambi brought out. The Buddha as a social revolutionary, Buddha as a person who challenges our prejudices, and Buddha as the person who tells us, I am not God, I am not your guru, I am not mokshadata, I am only a margadata. This is the phrase that Ambedkar uses. I am not a mokshadata, I am a margadata. In fact, the Buddha doesn't become a Buddha by following a Buddha. Buddha is telling you, be your own. The lamp is within you. The light is within you. So I think that message of Buddha we are losing. And we look upon Buddha only through the lens of Vipassana, meditation, contemplation, eating, ritual. We are confining Buddha. I think we're missing the larger social context of Buddha, which Kosambi first, and then of course Ambedkar, brought out in his book, The Buddha and His Dhamma. I mean, obeisance to Ambedkar, and rightly so, as the architect of the Indian Constitution. But I wish we read his book, The Buddha and His Dhamma, which was posthumously in 1910. And I have discussed that extensively in my book, because I think that's the message of Buddha that is relevant. The message of Buddha as a social revolutionary, not Buddha as a contemplative, meditative, just looking at nirvana time.
I think that is something that perhaps happens to all religions, where we tend to pick up more on the ritualistic aspects of the religion rather than to go into the real philosophy of it.
Buddha didn't form the religion. That's the
Yeah.
He didn't establish a religion. He established a of discovery by every individual. He never said I was God.
Yes.
He never said I am a guru. He never said follow me. So I think there's been a lot of romanticization of the Buddha over the years in the West and even in India. And we look on Buddha, rightly so. I mean, there is a spiritual, philosophical, most importantly, there is an ethical. Buddha was the first person to say that there is a thing called ethics. That ethics is not always all situational. You know, the masterpiece of situational ethics is the Mahabharata. You can justify anything depending on the context, right? So Lord Krishna could just the killing of Bhishma, the killing of Drona, the killing of Karna. It depends on the context, depends on the circumstances. So our ethics are situational, but Buddha challenged that and said, no, there is a thing called the right path, so, and the eightfold path, different dimensions of the fourth path. So, you know, so Buddha is a figure of ethics, number one. And two, Buddha is a figure of challenging an inequitous social order. That is something that we are missing in the debate on.
We would love to go on and ask more questions, but there are constraints of time. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and views with us. And so, with that, we come to the end of today's interactive session. On behalf of the Inspire team, I thank you once again, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, for taking time out to be here with us today and having this very insightful conversation with us. Thank you, viewers, for being with us in this stimulating journey. If you'd like to share your thoughts and ideas with us, or indeed be part of an interactive session, do reach out to us at inspired@profcongress.in. We look forward to hearing from you. I end today's session by quoting our guest, Mr. Jairam Ramesh himself. Regarding global warming and related issues, he said at one point of time, India has a responsibility to itself to fight climate change. A lot of food for thought there for each one of us. With these words, I close today's session. Till next time then, thank you, good luck, and goodbye.